Thanks so much.
There we go. We are recording.
Thank you. And I want to start by saying good morning, all the colleagues that just joined. As I said, we're still waiting for some colleagues to join. But I think for the 50 odd of you that's already on, thank you so much for joining the official launch of the third version of the work-related and integrity scale. So we typically refer to it in short as the RISC. Now, for those of you who've not gone through the RISC certification and still need a little bit of convincing, other than that, we've got 20% discount offered on certification for the month of March. The RISC is our most popular locally developed personality-based integrity test. Now, it measures traits that are theoretically but also empirically related to counterproductive work behavior. Now, unlike your overt integrity assessments, where the purpose of the assessment is quite obvious, whether somebody, if somebody's asked whether they've stole before, for example, personality-based assessments like the RISC is a lot more, well, it's less susceptible for socially desirable responding and proven, and that you'll see in today's webinar as well, to predict counterproductive work behavior. And I think this is also why we see the RISC being so enormously popular. I do, however, want to talk to the majority of the audience, who is, however, is likely people who either in the process of becoming certified on the RISC or who is already certified on the RISC. And the purpose of today is for us to update you on the improvements that we've made the past year on the assessment, now known as the third version of the RISC. And both myself and Charlene will be taking you through some of these updates. Now, Charlene will be taking you through some of the research updates, and I know we've only got you 30 minutes. So we will be hopefully highlighting some of these updates, but I do also want to refer you to the updated manual, where you will find a lot more information if you need. Also, just for the sake of, I think Sandra said in the beginning, with the sake of time as well, you'll see that you will likely not be able to communicate via audio. You will likely need to just add any questions, concerns that you may have in the chat, and we will respond to that. We will also be sending through the slides afterwards, and make sure that you receive the recording as well. And together with the Q&As, if we see that there's some questions that's being posed. Now let's start with what is new about the third version of the RISC. Now I need to change my slides. That's it. Now what's new? First of all, I think you saw it in the beginning of the front page of the slide as well, and that is the aesthetics of what we of the RISC. I think you will likely be as excited as what we are about the fresh, professional, new look and feel. So both the logo has been updated, but there's a new report design as well, which I absolutely think looks stunning. You see, not only have we changed the aesthetics of the RISC at the logo and the design, but we've also shortened the report slightly. So we tried to actually remove some of the white spaces that was in the report previously. Even though I don't think we won a lot of pages, it was an attempt to do our part for those who still make, those who still print these reports at times. Then we will be unpacking quite a number of updates that we made to the practitioners section, which we'll be going through in a second. But also to remember that with each completion of the RISC, you still receive a candidate report, a practitioner report, and then also a data extract. And that practitioner section is the last page in that specific report that's been updated, which we'll refer you to for the, during the rest of the webinar. Then you'll also see that we've removed items. And I think from a candidate experience perspective, we've had fantastic feedback in terms of the length of the assessment. So previously we had the RISC as being 144 items. which it's now been reduced to 82 items, which I think from a, as I said, user experience is fantastic. Now, we also made updates to the general norm. For those of you who are very familiar with the RISc and often use the RISc, you would have likely used the RISc 2020, which was the name that we made use of for the last norm update that we did. You will also know that typically best practice is to update norms every 5 years, and you may wonder, why would we want to update the norms if we've updated it in 2020? Now, for us, it just made sense because we made a lot of updates, even though it was not a requirement, it was just busy. We were busy with everything, and we just updated the 2020 norms to a 2023 norm, which Charlene will be taking you through in more detail as well. We added some additional fields to the data extract. So for those clients who typically make use of your competency reports or your integrated reports, which makes use of that data extract that's being generated with each completion, you will see that there are some additional fields added to that section as well. We updated the technical manual, which was a lot of hard work done by Charlene and team, which we're very excited about. And I recently, in preparation for this webinar, gone through the manual myself, and I just want to urge everybody, I mean, it's 130 odd pages, but it's really worth the read. And then we updated the way in which you access the assessment on JVR Online. And that you'll see currently, for those who typically make, I think the majority of our clients make use of accessing the RISc through JVR Online electronically, even though we know that it's also available hard copy. You will see when you select the RISc to be part of a project of assessment, so part of a battery of tools that you want to make use of. You currently have 4 options that you can include. The one option is just known as the RISc. The other one is RISc 2020. That one is the one that's been most often used up until now, with the most updated norms up until now with the launch of the 3rd version. And that one we will not be removing. So we've had clients asking, oh, what about I'm busy in the middle of a project and I can't have some people, scored on a certain set of norms and other people scored on a different set of norms. Don't panic. We're not going to be removing the RISc 2020 anytime soon. You can conclude on your projects. You can slowly, and when you feel ready, move towards the 3rd edition. We are earmarking, thinking of possibly then, removing the RISc options by December, but we will also make sure that we notify our clients well in advance. And for now, we will recommend that you trial the new RISc, that you get a good sense of whether what you enjoy about it, and look and feel, the look and the feel and the changes that we've made to it. But the RISc 2020 is going nowhere for those who are currently busy with projects. And then the RISc research is the first version that we used. So for those in this specific webinar interested in the new version, please make use of this one when selecting or for it to be part of a project within your JVR Online battery that's being administered. Now, there's been a lot of new, but a lot has also stayed the same. And now what stayed the same is the empirical model. So the constructs, the 12 dimensions that's been identified through many years of research and reconfirmed through research has remained exactly the same. So no changes to the structural model, the empirical model that the RISc is built upon. There was no changes made to the multidimensional indices. So the way in which it's scored, the way in which it's depicted or presented, reported on remained exactly the same. The items that remains within the RISc is exactly the same items that were in the previous versions as well. So we actually didn't change any content on these items. We only removed items. You'll also know that it's still available on JVR Online and also available hard copy only in English, for those of you interested. Would also stay the same as the 2023 pricing. So you would not see us changing anything that was published in Jan, and will also not be changing the pricing for the coming few months within 2023 as well. And then what also stayed the same is that certification is compulsory and very important for this specific assessment. So many things changed, but many things stayed the same as well. And I think what is the easier way for me to explain some of these changes from a reporting perspective is to actually take you through how we typically go about interpreting reports. Now, I know.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to clarify on the items that removed. As you said, it's the exact same items. So you might be wondering which items were then removed. So we typically refer to those as research items, and it's the research items that we just finally removed, so cleaned it up a bit. And those research items, since the previous version that you are also familiar with didn't pull through to the scales. So as Yanni said, we're not losing anything. It's not as if different items or fewer items are now going to calculate your total score for each scale. Those were research items that we just cleaned up. So just for those who wondered how we managed to make it so fewer items.
Fantastic. Thanks for the clarification, Charlie. And so again, what she said is that the same number of items that map to the different scales, it's exactly the same items that's being used in the current version. Apologies, in the third version as well. Now, for me to look at, to show some of the changes that was made from a report perspective, or on a report perspective, sorry, now I've got to, is to actually take you through the interpretation process that we typically know. First, we know that we actually start at the back of the report, like most other psychometric assessments as well. And that is, we typically start with a response style. We first investigate whether, no, not with the RISc, but some other assessments, whether there's any reason for us to question the validity of the report. And within the RISc, we typically use response style as one of these indicators. Then we actually page to the multidimensional indices. And then we go through to actually looking at these multidimensional indices and investigating whether there's random high scores within these indices. Then only we start interpreting the remaining scales, which I'll be taking you through in a second. Now, first, you'll see that the picture on the right-hand side is a screenshot from the last page of the practitioner report. And this is also where most of our updates were made. You'll see, so it will likely not look familiar for any of you. You'll see that previously we reported on all the items and all responses. Now we're reporting in that black box only on scale level responses. Now you'll see on the left-hand side, strongly agree, right through to the bottom line that actually says strongly disagree. And we typically investigate whether there's anything random there. So is this person somebody that is it typically responds yes to everything, strongly agree to everything, or use the extreme responses, or did they make use of the variety of response styles that's available to them? And that is typically the first thing that we do, and that's also the first change that we made to the report, is the way in which we report on this response style. Then what we do is we actually page to the multidimensional indices. Now, the first thing that I want you to note is that we kept on reporting both in the candidate report as well as in the practitioner report on percentiles. So we didn't change what we report on from a scale level. However, what is also then important is that you actually page through these 6 multidimensional to determine whether there are any risk or toxic out behavior within the candidate's profile. Now, in the event of a candidate indicating scoring patterns conducive of any of these 6 multidimensional indices, you would likely find that that interpretation at the bottom of these multidimensional indices, the one that you're looking at is the dispositional multidimensional indices, the description that's added both in the report but also in the manual would then likely be true of that candidate. But that is the first direction that we go into in investigating whether this is a high risk candidate or they're not. Then if we see that not one of the 6 multidimensional indices are triggered to, triggering all the different subscales that reports to this multidimensional indice, we start investigating whether there are random high scores within these. Now, again, as you already know, anything above the 80th percentile is seen as a high score. Now, this is also when we start looking at, especially if there's about 3 or more of these scales then flagged within these multidimensional indices, and we start exploring and interpreting those. And then only do we go to the interpreting the remainder of the scales. Now, because this is a personality assessment, it is important to investigate both low and high percentiles. So anything below 20th percentile is also quite unique to this individual, and anything above the 80th percentile is then also seen as high risk. But it is very important, as with any other personality assessment and any other psychometric assessment, and this remains true of previous versions and the current version, is to make sure that you interpret these in context, in relation to the job requirements, for example, and that you make use of other assessments to triangulate your information. This is a personality assessment, but I do a covert counterproductive assessment based on personality measure, but I would still urge people to make use of a bright side personality measure to understand the richness of personality. And Charlene will be unpacking a beautiful study that was done with the basic traits inventory to determine construct validity of the risk as well. But again, the measures contribute to one another, and it's not exactly or tapping in on exactly the same thing in all instances. So both divergent and convergent validity found within something like the BTI as well. And I think then what is important is, again, to showcase what the additions are to try and understand the scores and the percentiles. So some of the feedback that we got from clients were that percentiles might at times be overinterpreted. And I think what was important for us here is to provide within this last page of the practitioner report, our clients with as much information as what is humanly possible to ensure that accurate interpretations are done. So both candidate and practitioner report is still predominantly reported on from a percentile perspective. We added quite a number of other score ranges for clients to make use of, especially if they use different assessments in their batching. First of all, the raw total scores. Whilst it's valuable for research purposes, it should not please be interpreted on a candidate level, as you all know, is best practice. So that is predominantly added for those clients who's interested in doing research with the risk, and we urge you to do so. I think for us, and that's also the reason why we added a data extract, we would love to partner with any clients interested to actually look at criterion data within your organization, predicting performance within your organization, and that we collaborate in research projects like that. Then that's now the raw total score that I already referred to, that one would typically make use of from a research perspective. Also captured in your data extract. Percentile scores, you know that this would typically mirror the scores that was reported on earlier in the candidate and the professional reports, and you're familiar with those. Then what we've added, which is new, is the rarity of the percentile score. Now, the rarity of the percentile scores is exactly what the name suggests. It highlights how often the percentile score is found in the general population. The intention of the score is is to aid interpretation of percentiles as a standard score, rather than being mistaken for percentages, because sometimes we do find people mistaking the percentiles for percentages, which is not the case. And again, this aids to your interpretation of the results, is to make sure that you understand the rarity of where to find. Just to give you an example, this specific profile, 1 out of 24 people within the general population would be found to have a percentile score on low ethical control. You know, what this candidate on a 96 percentile, for example. Stanines were reported on previously, but we added STEMs as well. And T-scores were reported on previously, which we kept as well for those who typically make use of it. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but everybody is familiar with T-scores, everything above 60 being seen as high. STEMs, you know, anything above 8 is seen as high. Stanines, anything above 7, and percentiles, as I said, anything above the 80th percentile. You will, however, also find within the manual that there is a very detailed breakdown and interpretation guide, not only for percentiles, but you know, to ensure that you correctly interpret the different standard scores being used here or reported on here. The additions here was predominantly added for those clients who make use of other assessments and typically integrate results using STEMs, for example, for them not to need to convert it themselves, but then actually have the conversions included in the reports and the data extracts. That brings me to an end of what was added and changed to the report section. And I think on that note, Charlene, if you don't mind taking over the slides and take us through what was found from a research perspective.
Perfect. So pick my slides here. And then you'll just keep an eye on the chat box, please.
Definitely.
Will I need to get to the beginning? And you can see my slides. Johan, can you see my slides?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Can see?
Perfect. Okay, so as Johan said, I'm going to speak a bit about the stats update section, and I promise not to bore you too much, so no need to jump up and go grab a cup of coffee yet, and I'll try and keep it short and sweet. So we looked at a much larger sample. Because the RISc is so popular, we were able to look at 19,500 people versus the previous norm update. This is now prior to the 2020 update, but the previous norm update in our previous manual version was 1,000 people, 1,000 and something people. So massive update in terms of numbers that we could look at, which we were very excited about. Now, for the purposes of this short presentation and update, I'm not going to go into reliability estimates and all of that. All of that is updated in our new manual that you'll be able to find there, and not surprisingly, it is still a very reliable assessment, so nothing that concerned us there. But like I said, all of the details there in our updated manual. And then Jani did do a perfect introduction as to why we decided to do a new norm update so shortly after the 2020 update. So I'm not going to speak too much to that right now. And then I would like to take a bit more time just to go through some of the highlights that we found in a case study that we did. So just a very quick background on the breakdown of our sample, the 19,500 people that we looked at. It was a very 50-50. I think it was 54% female, 46% male. Bottom line, very equal breakdown in terms of those participants who did indicate male or female, so 50% breakdown there. Then our age range, bearing in mind that it is a work assessment, so we only look at working population. We don't include non-workers in our norming sample. we cleaned that out. So the minimum age was 18, maximum age was 77, but we worked on a mean of 34. So it makes quite sense. If we look at our working population, that is also then the stats that we saw in the breakdown. Then if we look at participants who indicated their race, most of the sample consisted of Black participants or Black workers, 55%, followed by white workers, 16%, Indian, mixed ethnic origin, as you can see there. So good representation. Then in terms of region, the majority of the people in our sample came from Southern African region. We do have some bits and bobs from international, so out of Africa as well, Australia, the US, the UK, but not enough for us to look at group differences. So to really get deeper into stats, there weren't significant representation to include it in our sample. And then what we further did is our updated norm is the South African norm specifically, but there is quite significant representation in terms of the other Southern African regions, so countries next to ours and slightly higher. And we did interestingly also look at group differences in that regard, and nothing that concerns us that jumps up that says we need extra norms. But of course, as the popularity grows internationally, we will have more data to continue that research to make sure that it is fair to use in different countries, as is now with our global norm. But like I just mentioned, people not in South Africa, we are quite confident right now that you can use that global norm because we didn't see significant differences that concerns us. And that goes, by the way, to our gender differences as well as our race differences. We did our proper investigations in terms of that you will find all the detail in the manual, nothing that concerns us from a difference in terms of groups that says we need separate norms or that it's not reliable to use across these groups. Then I want to jump into the case study. So just a bit of background, we had over 3,000 participants, or a data set of 3,000 workers that completed both the risk and the basic traits inventory. And I'm just going to briefly mention here, for those who are not familiar, the basic traits inventory looks at the big 5 personality traits. So your extroversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, the big 5. And what's so valuable about having substantive sample like 3,000 is we could really go look at what do we find if we look at these two aligned, what do we find when we look at the risk and the BTI? Because both are personality assessments. And this is especially valuable for us from a validity perspective to show that indeed our claim that we claim that the risk is an overt personality-based assessment and that it is indeed like that. So there will be instances that one would expect some correlations with another personality test. And there might also be instances that you expect negative correlations. So it was quite exciting that we could actually test this and look at this. And it also, a study like this also emphasizes from a practical point of view, the value if you can include another personality test, like Jani mentioned, more of a bright side personality test in your battery of assessments, because it allows you to understand some of the results that you see in the risk, for example, just to unpack those and to give that value added feedback and make better decisions. So we are not going to bore you too much with the stats that we did, but we looked at a dominance analysis to look at the correlations between facets of the risk and the BTI. And the reason for that specific analysis for those stats, those who get excited about stats out there, is just because it allows us to look at each risk and BTI scale separate to one another, because we know that they will influence one another if we just look at a pure correlation. So we looked at dominance analysis, as this allowed us to, first of all, look at the scales separate of one another, so we have a more of a cleaner correlation that we can interpret, if I can explain it in layman's terms. But secondly, you can go look that up in the manual. It also explained how much variance in the RISc, for example, was explained by the BTI scales. But I'm not going to get into too much detail with that stats. So I'm going to kick off with extroversion, because we found a fascinating correlation here. You'll see that there's a high positive correlation between egotism and extroversion. Now, that makes total sense if you look at it deeper, because the RISc's definition of egotism is more focused on the grandiose narcissism, that excessive self-esteem. That is how it is coined in the RISc. Now, a study published in 2009 by WRISc and WRISc looked at two types of egotism. They looked at your more hostile, introverted egotism versus a more self-enhanced, extroverted egotism. And if we think of that more self-enhanced, extroverted egotism, it makes sense, knowing how the RISc coins egotism, it makes sense why we see that high correlation between egotism and extroversion. And it specifically fits in, if we specifically look at the BTI, with the gregariousness in that extroversion scale. Then a negative correlation with pessimism and a negative correlation between callous affect. Just a side note here, I'm just highlighting the correlations that we picked up that were above 0.7. So more correlations there, but like I said, the detail you can find in the manual. And again, this makes sense. If we think of the positive affectivity that forms part of extroversion in the BTI, it makes sense that we see that negative correlation with pessimism. So no surprise that we found there. And then again, that callous affect. If you not very open to people and that shut off, then it makes sense that your extroversion will be on the lower side of the scale. Then also no surprise here, if we think of neuroticism in the BTI, so in general, that experience of negative effect in response to your environment, we're not very surprised to see the higher scores on cynicism, that negative effect, external locus of control. If you don't think you have much control over the outcome of events in your life, it's not surprising to see a higher score on the neuroticism, impulsivity, manipulation, and aggression. So a lot of those, I think, if you are quite familiar with the scales of the RISc, it makes quite sense if we see these high correlations. Then if we look at conscientiousness, absolutely expected to see that strong negative correlation with low effort for control. They really speak well to each other, and we expect that looking at the definitions of the two. And then pessimism, if you have that negative expectation, why bother with putting in the effort, putting in the planning? So that one also made sense for us. Then openness to experience, again, totally makes sense, that callous effect. You're not going to be very open to new events and to try out new things with a higher callous affect score. Then agreeableness, again, we totally expected to see that negative strong correlation with callous affect. And then again, your low effort for control coming in, which makes sense. You can imagine that if you're not very big on the planning and making sure you're putting out your path to reach your goal, that you're not going to really be the best team player and have that agreeableness side. And then the pessimism is also quite interesting, but expected, that strong negative correlation with pessimism. So that's my story, short and sweet, and I think we're doing okay for time. We've run a bit over time, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Charlene. Again, just to confirm what I said in the beginning, I know that there's quite a number of people that joined afterwards. It is that we will be making this recording available. There is updates made to the technical manual, which I think many of you will find. And there's a lot of interpretation you know, guidelines and additional information that I really think you will find valuable. Together with that, like we had a question here as well there, where you have a case where it might not have worked for you, where you had interesting findings, where you've got some questions in terms of interpretation, please reach out to us. We are more than willing to you know, we don't necessarily have all the answers, but let's see if we could explore with you as to why certain results look the way they do. And then also lastly, just to confirm, this is one thing that I know most of you may know, but the JVR really invest in research, and we really try and are very open to investigating our assessments within the client organization as well. So there where you do make use of the RISc, and you've got criteria and data available, and you do, we would be very willing to explore what such a study could look like, and for us to put together our, you know, our skills and heads, and to see what we can come up with to ensure that this assessment does actually pertain to return on investment, that you can show that it does what it's supposed to be doing within your context as well. Any questions, knowing that it's a webinar and you can't necessarily unmute yourself? I do just want to confirm, if there's any questions, you're welcome to type it in the chat box as well, and reach out afterwards to any one of us, any one of your JVR contacts, if there's specific questions that you would like to discuss in person as well. Knowing that we're about 6 minutes over, and I do see most of the people now saying thanks so much, and I do want to thank everybody for attending the session as well.
Thank you.
To stay on for another minute or two, just to make sure that there's nobody that's busy typing or no specific questions that wants to come through. We'll definitely send the slides, Demba. Thank you, Margot, for your comment as well. Miss Yaku, it's wonderful. Altrin, nice to see your name as well.
Thanks, Margaret.
Any specific questions? I think on that note, we can probably go to the next one, Charlene. Sandra, are you happy with us? You'll edit the recording, and we'll make sure that we then contact everybody